city there. We've now seen the military withdrawn from Portland. We've seen the incredible position of Trump threatening or raising the idea that the US presidential elections would be postponed. In effect, if he forced that through, if he's able to force that through, it would amount to nothing short of some sort of parliamentary coup in order to cling on to his power position. So to discuss this situation, we'd like to start maybe with Jai. If you could describe the situation in which has unfolded in Portland, what's the current situation vis-a-vis the Black Lives Matter, and how are we seeing the impact of the economic crisis affecting US workers and young people at the present time, and what's likely to unfold in that economic position? We saw the collapse of the US economy recorded one of its highest falls in the first quarter of this year, 32% fall, devastating effect on the lives of ordinary working people. So maybe, Jai, you could touch on some of those points and develop them a bit further.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for having me, Tony. So I guess firstly to touch on sort of the events happening in Portland in particular, and the heightened federal repression that has gone on there. What we've seen is that the federal police under the behest of Trump, particularly organized through the sort of the super department or super branch of government known as the Department of Homeland Security, which has a very complicated history in sort of being used as a tool of sort of the quote-unquote war on terror that was used as a pretext to attack and surveil particularly Muslim and Middle Eastern Americans. Sort of this department, its forces have been used to create this highly federalized, militarized federal police forces that has been used particularly in many Democratic-controlled major cities as sort of this attempt of Trump to whip up the base. Most notably, this has occurred in Portland, where the federal police have actually been forced into this retreat due to the growing strength of the protests, particularly there. The federal police's really blatant suppression of democratic rights unintentionally broadened out the character of the protests, extending the organic demands coming from the movement from beyond just the very important issue of Black Lives Matter and police brutality to being extended to these broader issues of really just basic democratic rights that are afforded by capitalist democracy, supposedly. Provoking many layers that don't normally go out to protest into the struggle. First there was the very widely publicized wall of moms. Then there was the wall of dads that showed up with a bunch of leaf blowers and blew away the tear gas that the cops were filming, and as well as veterans coming out and as an organized force in opposition to essentially, an occupation on U.S. soil, is what it essentially amounted to. And it really became clearer and clearer that sort of the standard riot control tactics could not win, forcing Trump and his Department of Homeland Security goons to go into retreat, as really the forces of reaction were just not strong enough to wage any kind of political battle against the radicalized movements in Portland. And Portland, kind of a side note, also completely dispels this myth that the violent confrontations, as the corporate media often likes to claim, are supposedly at the fault of protesters. Well, that's completely blown out of the water, since literally the day after federal police withdrew from Portland was one of the most peaceful nights of protests that Portland had seen since the movement began, basically. Talking about the Black Lives Matter movement sort of more broadly and its sort of massive sort of sweeping effects, and not as much in sort of the concrete policy, but very much so in terms of sort of this the tides changing in sort of the political consciousness of huge sections of the working and middle classes. It's sort of, in some senses, it's kind of dormant as of now outside of the major cities, but there's very much a lot of combustible material advancing around the question of education, which, as has been correctly pointed out by the movement, is intimately linked, especially particularly in the U.S., with systemic racism and sort of the legacy of how slavery and all aspects of racial violence and white supremacy is really not taught at all in our schools, in addition to how massively underfunded and unequal our education system is, based off of sort of the major housing segregation along the racial lines that still very much exists in this country, despite the end of Jim Crow proper. and not just in the South, in the North as well, and all throughout the country. There have been signs of labor being prepared to move and struggle against sort of these botched reopenings that are being proposed across the country, being pushed particularly by the Trump administration through Betsy DeVos, and also at the local level through many state governors that want essentially, at the behest of big business, want the country to reopen, and the big part of that is education, to continue exploiting the working class essentially, with no real care of what safety looks like. There have been some significant movements, at least especially from the tops of the leadership. Actually, the American Federation of Teachers has recently passed a resolution supporting, claiming to support any strikes related to fighting for safe reopening that their members put forward. And this is important significantly because this is despite teachers striking in most states being explicitly illegal. So this is really a tremendous step forward and could really lay the groundwork to mobilize many of the rank and file teachers to take up the struggle, because frankly their lives and the lives of their students are very much on the line. Essentially, the education system is being used as a test for reopening to kind of see what happens. Basic things like even guaranteeing and covering the cost of testing, let alone coronavirus treatments, are not even being included in the vast majority of these packages, even in the most so-called liberal blue states, including Massachusetts for that matter. And this is all in the context, wrapping up, of heading towards this massive eviction crisis, likely equal to, if not greater than proportion to the 2007-2008 crash, except this time is the added wrinkle of it happening in the middle of a pandemic. And there's no party that is representing any serious political alternative. Certainly not the Democratic Party, that is failing to put forward any serious leadership on the question of an eviction moratorium, right? Failing to provide adequate, decent stimulus and unemployment benefits. Failing to do these basic things like supporting systematic and increased education funding so that reopening can be safe, including guaranteeing testing. So really, the Pelosi's and the Chuck Schumers of the world that are at the head of the Democratic Party and towing the sort of the party line are failing to provide any serious leadership, and instead are putting forward what is essentially a compromise, at which they talk about very glowingly with the Republicans, rather than presenting any serious left leadership for the working class of any kind.
Yeah, well, you touched on some very interesting and important points there, Jide. Is the question of, one, the fact that the reactionary movement really was defeated in Portland, and they couldn't control the situation, which is a very important development. And then the other point you've touched on, which I think is highly significant, is a movement around of the teachers with the threats to strike in defence of their conditions and protect themselves vis-a-vis health workers, vis-a-vis the threat from the virus and their working conditions. So, I mean, it's a very important development, particularly in the context of the US, that US Labour, at least sections of it, are beginning to move into actions now. Now, the point I'd like to pursue a little bit now is the position of Trump, because Trump is plummeting in the opinion polls on the current trajectory set for a defeat, and then he comes out with this incredible statement that he's not necessarily going to respect the result of the election, and then maybe even the election should be postponed. And then there's a whole series of constitutional issues that have arisen, whereby it appears the states can change in the state assemblies. They can decide who they send as representatives to the electoral college, presumably bypassing any popular vote. So yeah, you have the prospect here, if Trump digs in this, of a real split opening up, and it would amount to some sort of a attempt of a parliamentary coup. Now, how far is that going to go? And surely more intelligent sections of the US ruling class are resisting that. And would it not also, if Trump took a stand like that, it is surely going to trigger a massive reaction of protest and an outpouring of anger?
Yeah, certainly. One thing I'll say to sort of start off is I think Trump has, I think as you alluded to earlier, has recently floated the idea of postponing the election, which is only truly shocking in the sense that it's shocking, only shocking in the sense that he actually said it out loud. In reality, we in the ISG and the Independent Socialist Group have considered in the early days of the coronavirus pandemic that Trump may try and use this pandemic to try and delay the elections. Back in say April and March, that was sort of a perspective that we were sort of throwing around and thinking about. But as the confidence of the ruling class in particular, and as even more workers and even much significant sort of some sections of his more middle class base have fled from Trump in spades. In this current context, for Trump to seriously suggest postponing the election is downright silly. His social basis is eroding massively, and getting the kind of support that would be necessary to actually implement that, especially since it's something that he can't even do himself, is really pie in the sky. So we're seeing this sort of period of volatility, of desperation from Trump, trying to sort of lash out at any method he can to try and maintain his political position. But at the same time, we're not seeing sort of the threat, so to speak, or floating the idea of delaying the election as a serious threat to capitalist democracy in the U.S. I think any attempt to delay the election could invoke a constitutional crisis. And after really the terrible misleadership of Trump in the wake of our triple crises of coronavirus, the economic crash that is only getting worse, and sort of the issue of police brutality and systemic racism, the ruling class is not at all willing to invoke such an extreme measure that would undermine the legitimacy of capitalism, particularly capitalist democracy in the U.S., in order to defend a candidate that they have pretty much nearly universally abandoned at this point. Even though Trump may attempt it, he will find himself deeply isolated and without a significant social base to support this sort of movement. For an incumbent, Trump's polling numbers are truly quite awful, trailing by north of 10% of Biden, the presumed Democratic candidate. Of course, nothing is certain, though. There is a serious possibility of Trump, for example, attempting to challenge in full force the use of mail-in ballots. But likely this will take on a legal challenge rather than any kind of protracted physical fight, sort of akin to what you were saying of an attempt at a military coup that will fail. Not a military, sorry, parliamentary coup that will fail. He has consistently sort of postured against mail-in ballots, and in this very intentional method, intentional way, because he correctly recognizes this, as well as does the broader Republican Party, as mail-in ballots as being sort of a serious threat to his reelection. And it cannot be ruled out that he'll attempt to legally challenge the validity of mail-in ballots, prolonging the election results and even trying to discredit them as being illegitimate and invalidate them. The corporate media currently is predicting that Trump's primary strategy may be to try and encourage as much of his base as possible to vote on election day, declaring victory based off of getting more of the initial day of votes, and essentially trying to declare all mail-in ballots illegitimate. Is sort of one idea that's being floated around somewhat popularly in sort of the corporate press. And again, while we certainly can't put anything past Trump to try out the strategy, I think he would be hard pressed not to try it out. I think to some degree, and already he is to a degree. Barring sort of major changes in the global political situation, I think the U.S. ruling class will not back this effort, as Trump has really proven himself way too volatile and incapable of stabilizing his own regime. No. I think it's most likely that the electoral challenges will be limited to really the legal sphere. But even though unlikely, it can't be ruled out that Trump will attempt, to say, for example, to seize in battleground states, to seize the mail-in ballots to try and physically prevent them from being counted, for example. This would be extreme, but it can't be totally ruled out. But it seems the most likely that this would take on a legalistic form rather than any sort of, certainly not at this time taking out any sort of physical sort of coup of any kind. His forces are just far too weak, as I think the protest movements in Portland very much show, being entirely reliant on sort of state violence and having no real social base supporting him. He does not have the political strength or the political capital or the support of the ruling class to be able to really succeed in this sort of war he's trying to wage, this political war he's trying to wage against mail-in ballots.
No, so in other words, he's very much on the back foot and he's in a very weak position fundamentally. But I mean, it is important what you emphasised, I think, there, Chai. If he moves down this particular road, you will have a health crisis, you have an economic crisis, you have a political crisis, and you're going to move straight away into a constitutional crisis, which poses a major issue and threat to the interests of US capitalism. They have a regime which, of course, is out of their control in reality for acting for them. And that poses the crucial question, what's the alternative? And you touched a little bit on that, Chai, but maybe we could turn to Tanya and begin the discussion of what is Joe Biden putting forward as an alternative. Indeed, does anybody see Joe Biden? Maybe is a pertinent question as well. And what are they offering, though? What is the Democrats putting forward as an alternative, both on the economic position, but on also all of the other social and political crises which is gripping US society at this stage? So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on this, the nature of this capitalist opposition led by Joe Biden.
Absolutely. I'm happy to. So, first of all, Biden barely campaigns. And when he does, it's almost entirely on an anti Trump message. So he focuses on Trump's latest blunder or right wing tweet, or, mistake on addressing the COVID crisis to say that Trump isn't suitable for the office of the presidency. He rarely mentions progressive demands or really any demands at all, choosing to focus on essentially being not Trump, which for the record is very similar to how Hillary Clinton ran her campaign in 2016, which was not successful in inspiring enthusiasm for her campaign or for the Democratic Party. So Biden, if you dig into his platform, he does not support Medicare for all or any sort of universal health care in the US, which is a widely popular demand among, frankly, across the working class and middle class in the US, both people who tend to vote for Republicans and also Democrats. So Biden instead wants to protect and build on Obamacare. Obamacare was a policy that was supposed to improve healthcare affordability and really was just a massive handout to the insurance company executives. And the Democratic National Committee, which is the corporation that essentially runs the Democratic Party, just voted not to include Medicare for all in their platform. So at this point, neither Biden nor the Democratic Party supports Medicare for all, despite there being a pandemic, a huge health crisis, and also vast numbers of Americans being laid off from their jobs and therefore losing their health insurance because we have an employer sponsored healthcare system in the country. Biden also, despite the massive movement and growing public support for defunding the police, does not want to cut funding for the police, and instead puts forward sort of wild, non-serious ideas for police reform, like the police should be trained to shoot for the knees instead of to shoot to kill. In consultation with Sanders, the Biden campaign has made some effort to appeal to progressive voters, taking on some progressive rhetoric around climate change, racial justice, healthcare, and affordable college. But in particular with the affordable college demand, and all of these demands are very limited, he is not talking about forgiving the over $1 trillion in student debt that is really holding an entire generation back in this country. And many of his new platform items directly contradict his past actions. So, for example, on the environment, he has previously been an advocate for fracking. He's now flip-flopped several times on fracking, saying he won't allow new fracking and then saying that he will, etc. In addition, he was an architect of the 1994 crime bill in the US, which is widely acknowledged to have led to our current mass incarceration. Now, he now has a number of platform points about reforming the criminal justice system. In a sense, now saying that he is going to reverse the exact system that he helped to design. The most important point is that there's a high likelihood that he won't follow through on any of these promises once in office. So many of the items on his platform that are seen as progressive are some of the same promises that Obama campaigned on in 2008: strengthening union rights, a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, healthcare reform. And Obama, despite having the presidency and the Democrats controlling both houses of Congress for the first 2 years after his election, failed to follow through on any of these promises. So, Biden is making the same promises again, but he also talks about his vice presidency under Obama as a model for what he hopes to accomplish. So at this phase, it feels almost like he's having a joke on the American people, trying to sell them the same bill of goods that was not followed through on during Obama's administration. And so ultimately, the problem is that the Democratic Party and Biden are beholden to the capitalist class. The Democratic Party has no democratic membership structures, and politicians are not accountable to the platform of the Democratic Party or the own platforms that they run on. At this point, Biden has more billionaire donors than Trump. And so we understand that there's a lot of lesser evilism, a term we use for people saying you have to vote for Biden because he is slightly better than Trump. But that also coexists amongst a huge amount of disillusionment among wide sections of workers and youth who do realize that Biden and the Democrats are not going to offer the solutions and the changes that we need, and they're not going to offer real solutions that address any of the three joint crises that we're facing at the moment.
No, that's very clear. I mean, it was quite staggering what you said there, Tanya. If our viewers can ponder the point of a student debt of $1 trillion. I mean, it's quite staggering. And I mean, you would have thought anybody offering a radical program would have at least raised the question of cancellation of the student debt. So, which brings us to the question, where's Bernie Sanders? What's he been doing in the course of all this? And what's he advocating?
So during the primary, before Sanders dropped out, he said that Biden represented everything that was wrong with the Democratic Party. However, immediately after dropping out of the race and suspending his campaign, Sanders pledged to campaign vigorously for Biden. And he's since been lecturing his supporters, claiming that it would be irresponsible not to vote for Biden. He's also publicly speaks now of his friendship with Biden and says that we need Biden in the White House. And so in the context of these massive Black Lives Matter protests that we've been seeing in the US over the past few months, Sanders and his supporters have been, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have been basically silent on the issue of the Black Lives Matter movement, on the issue of police brutality. And Sanders has actually explicitly opposed defunding the police. He's even put forward an increase in police pay rather than defunding the police. And so really, instead of turning to this mass movement that we see, Sanders, AOC, and the rest of the so-called left of the Democratic Party have just fallen in line quickly behind Biden and put their energies into internal party politics. And so we see this in terms of Sanders forming a number of sort of unity task force with Biden to try to reach compromises on, basically how to put forward the the minimum level of progressive demands in order to get workers and youth to vote for Biden. And so Sanders and other Democrats sometimes talk about building social movements, but they never use their resources and influence to actually organize them. And so, Sanders has put all this effort into trying to get the Democratic Party to support Medicare for all. And we see, in fact, with the recent DNC vote, that effort to reform the Democratic Party from within has failed. And so Sanders, continues to butt his head against the wall of trying to reform the Democratic Party and to make it more progressive. When he was a socialist, an actual socialist in the 1970s, he considered this to be a hopeless and harmful strategy. And so a common saying on the US left is that the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements. Sanders fantastically drew on the enthusiasm for socialism among a wide layer of workers and youth, but he's now betraying them by fighting to keep their energies confined within the Democratic Party, when what we desperately need is a new independent political party for the working class.
Well, thanks, Tony. Well, that's pretty clear in terms of a lost opportunity, really, which Sanders had, given the base of support that he had. So he identifies Biden as been a representative of everything's wrong with the Democratic Party, but concludes he's not prepared to do anything about it, fundamentally, in terms of trying to establish a real new alternative. But there are other forces, of course, on the left that we internationally have had quite a bit of publicity, that they've grown, they've had an impact around the Democratic Party through some of the primaries, particularly the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. So maybe turning to Sam, could you explain a little bit about the DSA, what their ideas for, what sort of ideas they put forward? Are they seriously suggesting you should work through the Democrats?
Yeah, I'd love to answer that. So DSA is an interesting organization. So they kind of refer to themselves as a big tent organization, which means that they have a really wide variety of people in terms of their politics within the organization, right? So they have some people that consider themselves just progressives or, left Democrats. They have some people who are pretty mainstream Democrats. They have people who identify as social democrats, and then they also have people who are identifying as, socialists, communists, or anarchists. So, in terms of their membership, it really runs the gambit from, pretty centrist American politics to, pretty radical. So all of these different groups are organized into their own caucuses. And so these are basically little organizations that are independent of one another. So while DSA is kind of the broader organization, it's almost as if there are lots of little mini organizations, within. So they're, a dues-based organization, so their members do pay dues, but they also have kind of a large phenomenon of paper members, which is, people who pay their dues. They're a member on paper, but they're not really taking part in any day-to-day activity, or really kind of contributing to the organization in any way other than by paying their dues. In terms of, do they support working through Democrats? I think the simple answer is yes, emphatically yes. So, Bernie Sanders wasn't the first person that they supported who was running as a Democrat, but they campaigned very hard for Bernie. They really tied themselves as an organization to his campaign, and they really used his, his 2016 campaign and even his 2020 campaign to build their membership pretty significantly, actually. So they have a habit of, endorsing people who are running in the Democratic Party. Perhaps they call themselves social democrats and DSA will endorse them. Sometimes people will run as Democrats, and then after they're elected, they will say that they identify as social democrats or, democratic socialists, and DSA will endorse them. So DSA, as a policy, doesn't see an independent left candidate as viable, or even, worth trying to run. So I would say that, not only does DSA, support working within the Democrats, but working within the Democrats is almost a prerequisite for having DSA's support.
Well, that's very interesting. In other words, it's broad tent. I mean, it's so broad, it's probably stretches the entire continent by the sounds of it, in terms of its political makeup. But it's obviously this question. I mean, you have a burning need for a new party. There's the basis there for it, based on all of the mass movement we've seen around the Black Lives Matter movement, and what indeed happened with the Sanders campaign, all of which points to the fact there is a crying need for a new party. But the CWI has supporters in the independent socialist group in the US. So, Sam, maybe you could outline a bit further what is the ISG putting forward and advocating at this stage?
Yeah, so I think, certainly what we're trying to kind of draw out and be really open about is the need for, an alternative political force that, has its base in the working class, that is an alternative to the Democrats and the Republicans, right? So, like you said, and like others have touched upon, right now we have COVID-19, we have, the Black Lives Matter protests, we have, the election coming up that people are increasingly disillusioned with. In addition, I think, we have about 10% of US households facing possible eviction. So the conditions for, having these, movements arise and then being able to kind of link them together into, some sort of new left organization, or even, ideally some sort of working class party, the conditions are appearing. And, now more than ever, this is a situation that we really want to, be seizing. So, we're really calling for people to, as Tanya said, resist the lesser evilism that's really being peddled by, the ruling class media and the Democrats, and for people not to be guilted into supporting the Democratic Party, because that is, really a dead end in terms of, building the forces of the working class that are going to be necessary to deal with all of the issues that we're seeing right now. And so we're calling as well for, all of these movements to be linked together, right? Because in an underlying way, they're all connected. So the movements for, safe school reopenings, anti-police brutality, pandemic relief, we want all of these to, work together. And then maybe out of that, we could see the creation of some sort of, organization that we could, work within and build on. In addition, we're calling for people to, stand in solidarity with the protesters all around the country, especially the ones in cities that are being targeted by federal troops. Like Jai went into so far, it's been, what we saw in Portland was, federal troops were sent in, and that actually ended up with more people in the streets, and the federal troops had to leave pretty soon. But, as, crises of capitalism get worse, and, perhaps federal troops increase or state repression increases, we're going to need, organized, working class organizations that can, resist the state violence. So that's kind of generally some things that we're calling for right now, and kind of points that we're trying to get out to people, whether it be, at events or through our newspaper or stuff like that.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I think that's given a clear idea, but it's quite a stunning situation. I think both Tanya and Jai and Sam have outlined. We have 1 trillion student debt. We have an incredible figure that Sam just gave of nearly 10% of households are threatened with eviction. I mean, how many millions of people is that going to affect in the US? It's a stunning situation. We have a president talking about the possibility of postponing the elections, federal troops deployed onto the streets of cities, federal troops taken off the streets in cities because they can't control the protests. You have really the outlines of an element of a semi-civil war situation opening up. And what hypocrisy from Trump. He threatens to postpone the US presidential elections, and of course, in the same breath, will immediately condemn the Chinese regime for suspending elections to the legislature in Hong Kong. I mean, it is incredible hypocrisy on his part. But finally, maybe we could turn to Jai, just to draw the discussion to a conclusion about what are the prospects for a new party that are developing in the US. Probably that will be given more of an impetus if the Democrats win the election, paradoxically, because it will expose them further for what they really are? And what's the prospects for new struggles in the run up to the elections, after the elections, and the prospect for winning increased support for socialist ideas?
Yeah. So in the immediate term of this election, while we are still very much discussing our position in the ISG as an organization, um, in general, as of now, Howie Hawkins, who is running as a left Green Party candidate on an explicitly socialist program, fighting for a socialist economy, and sort of explicitly against sort of this two-party duopoly that holds such a tight grip on society, seems like the strongest left candidate to support if we're talking about the presidential sphere. Hawkins seems to be, at least in word, it's remains to see how serious he really is, looking towards building a new workers' party, and this is certainly something that we in the ISG would support as a broader political practice, as Sam and Tony have already gone into quite a bit. The Democratic Party, time and time again, has really proven itself incapable and frankly disinterested in taking up working class politics. It is a through and through capitalist party, backed by and controlled by big business interests. What we need is a new party, a workers' party that can take on an explicitly socialist program, to serve as a real alternative to this sort of to this two-party system that maintains this deep stranglehold on American politics. And as Sam was saying, the conditions are right. We have the not sort of reiterate all the very important economic points, like say impending evictions and the crisis of healthcare that Sam went into a bit. We talked about earlier. We have these two incredibly unpopular candidates in which people are really forced to choose between the lesser of two evils. That in all reality, in real political content, and not just in sort of messaging and framing, are even more indistinguishable than they were in 2016. As Tanya was saying, Biden continues to run on this "I'm not Trump" campaign, as Clinton did before him, and as Tanya didn't get as much time to mention, Biden's campaign has immediately and completely rejected most of the attempts by the Sanders campaign to pull things somewhat left of center. It is really clear that Biden is not at all interested in representing workers. And now we, of course, do not take a denunciatory approach. We in the ISG understand better than most why workers feel so compelled to vote for Biden and the pressure that workers are under the weight of the corporate media and our two-party system. But we in the ISG, we must stand against the stream and chart out what history tells us. And that is that voting blue, no matter who, will only set back the progress of the U.S. working class in trying to build its own political voice. The majority of workers, the reality is, want a new party. And that's been the case for a long time. And it now is as good a time as any to begin building its embryo to develop a new political voice for workers against the exploitation and the diametrically opposed interests of big business. As Sam was talking about, these movements that are sort of this combustible material that's sort of ready to burst at any moment, particularly around evictions, around unemployment benefits, around needing a rent freeze, right? Around basic healthcare and even just testing, for God's sake, right? There's so much material here. The broader Black Lives Matters movement that is fighting against something as basic as don't kill us during a pandemic, right? Of all times, right? Stop killing disproportionately people of color, especially in this period where we're supposedly being told by the working class that we're all in this together. Even that is being met with such vicious resistance by the forces of capital, right? And it all comes back to this point that these movements can and should and need to serve as this new embryo, this new beginning of getting organized, even if on a regional or local level, some new political voice for workers, whatever form it may take, that can actually represent the working class. What we need is a new party, right? One that will fight for socialism and for regular working people, that will fight for things like Medicare for all, that will fight for $50 an hour or even a $20 an hour minimum wage, right? That will fight for even something as basic as paid sick leave, which is still not a guarantee in the US, which, again, even during a pandemic, that's not a guaranteed thing that exists, unless you are a full-time worker, and even then, it can take months or even years for that actually to accrue in the first place. These basic things that capitalism refuses to give us themselves show very clearly how deeply incapable and disinterested capitalism is in actually defending our rights. And what we need is socialism, ultimately. And the consciousness around that has only been expanding, especially during the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, this demand for defunding the police and actually investing in working class communities is really sort of it's the seed of socialist consciousness, an understanding of equity, of actually that the resources very much do exist under capitalism, but they are not being spent on workers, they're being spent on forces that oppress workers, particularly the most sort of oppressed layers of the working class. And that logic can be furthered, can be pushed forward by a serious attempt at building a political force. Join the Independent Socialist Group in the project of building that new party and building a political voice for the working class.
Okay, Jai, well, thanks very much. And just to reiterate that point, if you're watching from the United States, put yourself in touch with the Independent Socialist Group. If you'd like more information or to see further analysis of the CWI, go to our website at socialistworld.net. You can follow us on Twitter at CWI Socialists. You can follow us on Instagram at Socialist World. And above all, we'd ask you to register and subscribe to our CWI Media YouTube channel as well. But beyond that, we'd also want your support. Don't be passive, don't watch and just listen. Join the struggle. Join us and support us financially. To support us, we'd encourage you to take a look at our Patreon, where you can subscribe with a monthly fee to donate towards CWI Media. All donations are, of course, very welcome, large and small. But for £20 a month, for your support, we'll be sending you a CWI welcome pack, which will include socialist reading material, a CWI flag, and other extras. To subscribe to become a patron, go to patreon.com/CWI dash, and that will be there will be a link to that and description of it below on the screen coming up in a minute. Additionally, you can make a one-off donations at paypal.me/donate to CWI, which is also appearing on a link below on the screens. So we'd appeal to our viewers, we thank you for watching, but we'd appeal to you not to be passive, to join the struggle, get involved, find out more about the CWI and join us in the struggle for a world socialist alternative. And we'll be back next week looking at a further angle of this crisis, how it's affecting young people in particular, and we look forward to seeing our viewers back then. So thanks for watching. Thanks to Tanya, Sam and Jai for, I think, what has been an extremely illuminating response to some of the points we've raised with them. And we'd appeal to our viewers, stay safe, keep struggling, and onwards in the struggle to build a socialist alternative.